we know that if people are trying to lose weight and they're being judicious about their food intake, they're trying to diet, but they're not getting sufficient sleep, 70% of all the weight that they lose will come from lean muscle mass and not fat.
Wow.
Because your body becomes very stingy in giving up its fat when you are underslept. So dieting becomes, quite redundant in that regard. You want to keep the muscle, you want to let go of the fat, and sleep deprivation will do the opposite to you. So that's the first thing. It's a foundational element on which, nutrition sits. And by the way, I'd love to talk all about sort of diet, appetite, sort of increased caloric intake, increase in exactly what you desire to eat when you're underslept. There's great data there. But let me move over to activity. We've spoken about the foundation on which diet sits. When you are not sleeping sufficient amounts, firstly, the likelihood that you will actually exercise decreases significantly. Your motivation to be physically active drops away. Even if you are physically active, the intensity of your workout will not be as strong, so it's less effective and less efficient. Things like your vertical jump height, your muscle contraction strength, even the exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen in your respiratory systems, they get worse when you haven't slept.
Wow.
What's even more frightening, however, is that your risk for injury increases when you are exercising but not well slept.
This is incredible.
And they did a great study where they looked at some athletes across a season, and then they tracked their sleep. And then they bucketed those athletes into the different amounts of sleep, 9 hours, 8 hours, 7 hours, 6 hours. What they found was a linear relationship between less and less sleep and increasing risk for serious injury during a sports event. So there is yet another demonstration of how even if you're trying to be physically active but not getting sufficient sleep, it can be harmful. The beauty of that part of the relationship, and the same for diet, is that it's bidirectional. That if you actually, improve your sleep, you can improve those two things. But conversely, those two things will improve sleep.
Yeah.
So if you start to correct your diet, you start to sleep better. We've already spoken about caffeine. But physical activity is a great way to enhance both the quality and the quantity of your deep sleep. So physical activity, as long as it's not too close to bedtime, if it's too close, your metabolic rate stays too high, your core body temperature stays too high, and that will prevent sleep.
I'm seeing that a lot as well, and I've experienced that myself in terms of squash is one of my favourite games. But if I play squash at about 7 or 7:30 p.m., I can't sleep that night. I'm lying in bed at night, and I know it's about 5-ish for me really is the last time I can go on the squash court, have a great workout, have an enjoyable game, and everything seems to have sort of gone back down to normal before I try and sleep at night. And I'm seeing that a lot with patients, which again, if people are after work, they're trying to fit their workout in, it becomes challenging because the modern world is making it sometimes quite tricky for us to live in harmony with our natural circadian rhythms.
Yeah.
But I see that a lot. Working out intensely in the evening is a problem. Have you done research on that in your lab?
So we've looked at this with body temperature too, and I understand that people, I still want to celebrate and embrace the idea of people exercising. I think that's critical. And even if it's late into the night, best not to do that. But if you do that, a good way to try and solve the higher core body temperature is to have a bath or a shower right before bed. And
a hot bath, right?
A hot bath is best, or a hot shower, because what happens is that all of the blood comes to the surface of your skin. You kind of get nice rosy cheeks. And that acts like this huge thermal radiator, taking all of the heat out of the core of your body. And as a consequence, the core body temperature will actually plummet and you will fall asleep easier. That's the reason that it's always easier to fall asleep in a room that's too cold than too hot. Too cold is taking you in the right temperature direction for good sleep. So if you do have to work out at some point late into the night, you can try that trick. But for the most part, try and get your workout in a little bit earlier.
It's a great tip, though, for people, because I know there'll be many people listening to this who probably do try and get their workout in the evening. So that's a great little tip that they can put into practice to see if they can, ensure that workout doesn't hinder their ability to get good sleep. As you were talking about vertical jump, and as a sportsman myself, I sort of, this really, gets me excited to think, actually, can you improve your performance by sleeping more? And immediately what came into my head is an interview. I think it was an interview, or maybe I heard this comment. I mean, you may know more about this, but I have heard that Roger Federer may get, I think he's been on record to say he gets 12 hours of sleep a night. I don't know if that's true or not. Have you heard about that at all?
Yeah. So he does. He gets about 12 hours of sleep. And if you look at lots of sports athletes, LeBron James, the basketball player, he suggests that he gets somewhere between 10 and 11 hours. He splits that. He has a nap routinely during the day of about an hour and logs about sort of 9 to 10 hours at night. Usain Bolt, he says he never gets anything less than 9 hours. And I believe for one of his world records, he had only been awake for about 35 minutes because he'd taken a nap.
Oh, I love it.
Right before, I think it was an Olympic gold and a world record that he broke. And he had only been awake for about 35 minutes because he'd slept. And, this is what, I do some consulting now for some Premier League football teams as well as NBA, NFL in the United States, because they're starting to realize that sleep is probably the greatest legal performance enhancing drug that you could ever wish for. And it's not just in terms of preparation for exercise, by the way, for which it is spectacular. It's also about recovery. And that's one of the places where I see a lot of their sports physios perhaps not recognizing what they can do with sleep. Yeah. They front-load it about before the game, which is great. But often when teams are playing, they're playing multiple games. It's about a season, and it's all about maintaining their players' health. And that recovery period after a game before you play the next game is key. Players will dive into baths of ice to try and reduce swelling and inflammation. Sleep is a critical part of that sports equation. You need sleep on both sides of that. So it's fascinating. I say it just for people who are, really interested in being physically active, maintaining their peak performance. Make sure that you also consider sleep after being physically active as well.
When we talk about peak performance, everyone's looking for peak performance these days. Of course, those guys are athletes, right? So their idea of peak performance is probably, when Roger Federer is playing in a Grand Slam tennis match, he wants to be operating at peak performance. But, Joe Public also wants peak performance in their lives. They want to be able to wake up feeling refreshed, maybe get their kids to school without there being a whole load of arguments at home because everyone's underslept and tired.
Yeah.
They want to get to work and perform well in their job so they feel that they're contributing to whatever work they're doing. They're operating at a high level. So, some people may think, Roger Federer, LeBron James, yeah, sure, great for those guys, but, I don't need as much sleep as them. So my question would be, what can we learn from those guys then in terms of how they prioritize sleep? How much sleep do we need every day? But also, in episode 14 of this podcast, it was a few episodes ago, I interviewed Nick Littlehales, who for many years has been advising clubs like Manchester United, the England football team, and he talks about this idea of 90-minute sleep cycles. I don't know if you've read his book or you're familiar with this recommendation, but I find it, he talks about this whole idea of 5 90-minute cycles that we need throughout the day. And I know some people found that quite helpful to take the pressure off them at night. So quite a few questions there, Matt, but I wonder if we could try and go into those areas a little bit.
Yeah, so right now the recommendation is for most adults get 7 to 9 hours of sleep. And to get 7 hours of sleep, you probably need at least a 7.5 hour sleep opportunity. I think that's what many people miss in recommendations from sort of experts. They say, get your 7 hours of sleep. So people think that means, well, if I go to bed at, 11 p.m. and I wake up at 6 a.m., then I've got my 7 hours of sleep. That's not true. You probably will have only logged about sort of 6 hours and 40 minutes, and that's not enough. So you need to think about the sleep opportunity time as being probably around about 8 hours optimally. What we also know is that once you get below 7, we can start to measure objective impairments in your body and in your brain as well. The problem is that most people don't realize that they're sleep deprived when they're sleep deprived. This is a big problem with sleep loss. And, the analogy, I guess, would be a drunk driver at a bar. They've had a couple of pints, maybe a few shots, and they pick up their car keys and they say to you, look, I'm fine to drive home.
Yeah.
And you say, no, I know that you think you're fine to drive home, but trust me, you're not. You are objectively, you're impaired. It's the same way with a lack of sleep, that our subjective sense is a miserable predictor of objectively how well we're doing with a lack of sleep. And I think that's one of the issues that I try to sort of help dismiss in terms of a notion. I think the other thing that's problematic too about getting too little sleep is that your baseline level of how you think your health and your wellness is just becomes chronically low, and you accept that as if that's just where I am in life. This is just me. This is as good as it can be. And people don't realize that if you're to change something like sleep or stress or diet or physical activity, there's actually a better form of you waiting on the other side of those things.
Absolutely.
It just requires perhaps, some knowledge and an invitation to go there.
Matthew, I call this podcast "Feel Better, Live More" for a reason, and it really just echoes what you just said then. When we feel better by, prioritizing sleep, by, looking at these other pillars that I talk about, we get more out of life. We're a better version of ourselves. We have better relationships. We have, much deeper, more meaningful interactions with the world around us when we're feeling better. And I guess you would argue that when we sleep better, we live more.
We do. I mean, firstly, that data is very clear that if you look across epidemiological studies, millions of individuals in these studies, a very simple truth comes out, which is that the shorter your sleep, the shorter your life. That short sleep predicts all-cause mortality.
Wow.
And so, I think
we just need to stop and just let that sink in for a minute. Depriving ourselves from sleep will shorten our life.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
that's the powerful data that, the global sleep loss epidemic that is underway right now, which I believe is probably one of the greatest public health challenges that we now face in the 21st century, it is a slow form of self-euthanasia.
If you enjoyed that clip from my podcast, here's another powerful clip that is really going to help you with your health and happiness.
I used to think, weight loss is just about willpower. It's about calories in, calories out. The energy balance equation is always true, but people always misinterpret it to mean that just eating fewer calories leads to body fat loss. It does not.